Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 1. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours, and not those of our employers. Just so you know what to expect from this new show, we're going to start out with some news, specifically that the big three public clouds have got rid of their charges for egress, or the charges for getting data out of the cloud, and an article detailing 4 years of regrets and learnings from running a startup. Then, we'll do some free consulting on whether people getting started with the public clouds should be scared of the free tiers and what else they can do to learn cloud concepts. In the media lately, there's been a few different articles about egress fees. So we started out with Google Cloud back in January, and then we had the announcements from AWS and Azure. So what's the sort of feeling around egress fees and how much of a difference they really make to people?
I feel like a lot of them are doing it because it's the thing to do. It's the new wave, and it's not anything groundbreaking, and it saves them from any kind of antitrust lawsuits in the future. So win-win.
I love the marketing material around these announcements. Microsoft's in particular is my favorite because it's so shameless. Like the opening sentence is, "We support customer choice." And does anyone remember back in the 90s and 2000s when the EU fined Microsoft hundreds of millions for their undying support of customer choice? I guess you've got to have some silver lining with this EU data law, but yeah, I found the marketing material pretty funny.
Yeah, I think this is probably something that we're going to see more widely across cloud services going forward. Like the three big ones have done it. Everyone else is sure to follow suit, particularly for egress relating to workloads being migrated out. I feel like maybe they could be a little bit more generous and there should be a button that you can just press that says I'm migrating out, rather than having to raise support cases to get limits increased and things, because 100 gig feels quite small, particularly for the kind of workloads where they're going to be migrating out of the cloud at scale where they might care about the egress fees. But other than that, I think broadly in support of it.
Is that 100 gigs total or like per day?
I think it's 100 gigs from the point that you say that you're migrating a workload out. And from that point onwards, you get the 100 gigs. And if you want more than 100 gigs, certainly in the case of AWS, and I think it's the same with Azure, you have to then go and raise a ticket to say, I have more than 100 gig of data. Here's the amount that I expect to be migrating out. So it could be a little bit tricky if you've got like hundreds of gigs of data in object storage or something that a lot of people have that you then need to move.
I'm considering this sort of like a trial amount of data. So with budgets being tightened and free money drying up for someone managing infrastructure in the cloud, and their finance team is saying you need to slash these budgets, 100 gigs might be enough to prove some new model for how their workloads run. But after that, once it's proven, I think they'll need to request that support to get the actual workloads out. But it's a start.
Yeah, it's enough to run a POC of, will my application run in another cloud, or can I run it on-prem or whatever? So, yeah, I think it's probably fine to begin with, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a cheap way to prove it.
It reminds me a little bit of the news that we had, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but with the announcement of the R2 service and that whole piece around egress fees and whether they were fair or not, and the marketing around that. So it's been a topic that's been in the news now for quite a long time, but it does seem coincidental at best that it's the same sort of timing as the European rules. So another piece I saw come in was Jack Lindemood's "Every infrastructure decision I endorse or regret after 4 years running infrastructure at a startup." And this went through and talked about all of the different decisions that they'd made in their startup and which ones he thought were good decisions, which ones were poor decisions, and why.
I think EKS is an interesting choice if you're a startup. Having the overheads of having to manage that and version upgrades and everything else probably isn't a decision that I'd have made, but maybe they were looking to have a little bit more of a hybrid model where they had some workers on-prem or workers in different clouds. I don't know. For my money, I'd have probably gone with something a bit more managed, like ECS to begin with. And then if I found that I needed the feature set of Kubernetes, probably move to that, because that would have been a relatively easy thing to do.
I mean, how long ago was it? It was 4 years, I suppose. 4 years ago, was ECS in the same state it is now, or?
Yeah, broadly, ECS was there. Fargate existed. It would have certainly been as valid of a choice then as it is now.
I think maybe he got talked into it because he also says he regrets going straight on to the EKS managed add-ons. So I think maybe someone talked him into it. He just kind of went with it. But I really like this article. I actually came across it through Mastodon, and there's a lot of decisions made, but it's about a paragraph on each. And I thought he did pretty fair, pretty balanced take on everything.
Yeah, there's certainly nothing in here that I would broadly disagree with if I was coming up with a new set of architecture for a startup. I think his point there about not adopting certain SaaS products early on is a pretty good one. I think there is a lot of tendency out there to build versus buy in certain components where they make sense. Certainly, it seems to suggest that there are sort of things that he would have rather moved on to begin with, that he then ended up migrating out of something he built himself. So I think that was pretty good. It seems like a relatively sane set of decisions as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there's a good mix in there, isn't there, of different things. So he talks about things like Slack and Notion and different bits like that, PagerDuty. So they're certainly not building everything themselves. And it does feel to me like the broad industry kind of direction is, your SaaS first, and then you're going into your function service sort of stuff, or and you're kind of going down those stacks. And it certainly seems that those decision-making points anyway, that people prefer to have more certainty. But that's always the trade-off, isn't it, between how much do you want to do yourself, how much control do you really want over this versus, the associated problems with doing that.
Yeah, one of the things that he says in here that really stands out to me actually is not using open telemetry early. I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make, is they worry about monitoring rather than worrying about telemetry. And I feel like in the cloud world, particularly when you're running microservices on Kubernetes and things like that, you need to kind of worry more about traceability and telemetry and tracking API call response times and things like that more than you do, does my server have any disk space left, or is the CPU slammed? Like, worry about SLAs and things like that over worrying about what the server's doing. So that is probably a pretty good learning point. And arguably, if I were building something from scratch, the biggest one I'd take from this.
What do you think of his point around not using function as a service as a regret? Because I've heard very mixed views on function as a service generally. Is it something that the three of you have used?
Yeah, I used Lambdas. The problem with Lambdas is that it starts off really easy with a small use case, and then someone says, let's take it one step further, and someone says one step further, and all of a sudden you've gone from Lambdas to step functions, and then it goes one step further, and some other product design requirement comes in, and all of a sudden you now have something that shouldn't be serverless and should probably be dedicated as a Kubernetes job or something.
Distributed monoliths are a real risk if you're going to go down the serverless route. Also, if you don't have the right tooling around serverless in terms of how systems are interacting with each other, what standard patterns are going to be going across all of these lambdas, you're going to have a bad time. There's going to be a lot of ad hoc random ways in which stuff calls other stuff. And as I say, it can lead to a very overcomplicated distributed monolith.
Yeah, it's all about keeping those things loosely coupled, using message queuing, event buses, and stuff like that, isn't it, to really do it properly. And then also understanding what the life cycle of those applications are in something like Lambda. And I'm sure it's exactly the same in the Azure and GCP world as well, where Node 16 loses support fairly soon in Lambda. And you need to be aware of that because you can't do deploys to it, for example, when it loses support. So it's just being aware of the trade-offs you're making. Make sure that you're keeping up to date with stuff. Make sure that you've got the right logging in place. Make sure that you're coupling or not coupling the applications in the right way, and you'll be fine. But I think he had some very specific GPU workloads that he was looking at that perhaps Lambda definitely wouldn't have been the right fit for. But yeah, I think it's go into it knowing what you're getting into, I guess, is really the way I'd look at it.
I mean, there are some pieces in here that seem pretty uncontroversial to me around using infrastructure as code and CI/CD pipelines and things like that. I thought Carpenter was interesting in there. Is that the standard way that you would recommend interacting with the EKS nodes at the moment?
It's very quickly becoming the standard for the way that you auto-scale Kubernetes and decide what node types that you're going to use and things like that. Before, there were things like cluster autoscaler and you were using taints and node selectors and stuff, which were always a little bit hacky. I never had the best experience with cluster autoscaler being particularly reliable. I haven't got much hands-on experience with Carpenter, but I've absolutely heard that it is the way to be going if you were doing things from scratch now.
And Terraform seems an unsurprising piece. I mean, there seems to be a lot of love out there for Terraform generally, but interesting that they directly compare it to the cloud formation templates and said that they preferred to use the Terraform even though they were targeting AWS specifically. One that surprised me a little bit was the Homebrew piece there for the company scripts, because I've come across Homebrew for Mac distribution of packages or those sorts of things, but I haven't come across it before as something that organizations were using internally for scripts. Is it something any of you have used for that?
I've heard of places having internal Homebrew repositories that they use to distribute like little internal scripts or internal applications to do stuff. But I've never worked anywhere that's actually done it. But it does strike me as quite a good idea if you need a centralized place to have those and a standardized way of installing them. Homebrew is probably not a bad way to do it. It works across Mac and Linux, so you could run it on workstations, you could run it on jump boxes. It feels like actually a fairly good idea and not something I'd thought of.
We've done a PSC internally to run Homebrew, our internal CLI through Homebrew, but I think it died a death and we just defaulted to pip because it worked fairly well.
I think that's the other thing is that any time that I've written those scripts, they've just ended up in a repository somewhere and people are quite comfortable doing a Git clone of those and using them. So unless you've got particularly non-technical people doing deployments or something that you maybe don't want to give access to Git for some reason, that might be a solution. But by and large, I just want to pull whatever's on the main branch of Git for that set of scripts and use those.
I hadn't compared the two, but that is the logical thing that I would normally have come across in the same place.
Yeah, that's mostly what we do. Git, clone the repo or clone things, or if I can help it, I will try to avoid scripts entirely and try to bake it into something like a dev container so that way no one has to do anything to their host machine.
One regret I'm a little surprised by is the AWS premium support. I found that really good. Maybe the startup size, if you're not doing anything particularly novel, it's expensive for what it is, but particularly in my company, a lot of people are doing new things in AWS and often it'll be questions I get about some product I've not even heard of. And it's quite handy to be able to reach out to AWS and say, hey, we need some information on this thing, and they'll find a subject matter expert in the company and talk to you. And that's been really helpful. It's probably saved us a lot of pain investigating solutions that just wouldn't have worked for us without that context. The other one I strongly disagreed with was multiple applications sharing a database. Regret is not a strong enough term, I think. Probably like soul-crushing despair, maybe. If you're at a startup and that's what you're doing, you be the one to enable that. Don't be the one left holding the bag when it all goes pear-shaped. Definitely not speaking from experience.
Yeah, I've seen it far too many times in the past where that single database becomes a real bottleneck and there is no amount of compute that you can throw at it. Like Postgres scales pretty well, but Postgres doesn't scale to the point where you've got like a 70 terabyte table or something ridiculous like that.
I've seen that happen too many times. It starts with a tangential project, right? That they're related. So it might make sense to have them maybe a different schema, but same host. And then just snowballs from there.
Yeah. The other thing that I've seen that I feel like is a cardinal sin is putting business logic into stored procedures in the database. Just don't do it. Like I worked at a place a few years ago where there was 20 years worth of business logic in stored procedures in the database. And it meant that we had very, very heavy compute on a Microsoft SQL server. And no amount of tuning of stored procedures is going to fix that. So don't do a single DB and please keep business logic separate.
It's the sort of thing where that one person knows how it works and they leave and then everyone is terrified to do anything with it. So it's left there and you just tweak everything around it to try keep the snowflake going.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's that thing Jim wrote in 1996. Yeah. We can't touch that.
Exactly.
Isn't that basically all IT running on the planet?
Pretty much. But if you're a startup, you can avoid it. Please do.
The only thing worse I've seen is a company I know is still using a mainframe like IBM, Oracle mainframe, big one. And that's like the crux of their whole system. And they can't get off of it. And it costs them a pretty penny to keep that thing running year to year.
Yeah, well, it's the same with licensing for anything legacy, isn't it? Maybe one of his points should be making sure that you've got something in place to deal with tech debt early on. Like, don't accumulate it, or if you do have to accumulate it to get something running quickly, make sure you've got a plan to get out of it. Don't be the guy running IBM DB2 in 2024.
Well, that's more of like an SDL sync thing than an infrastructure thing, right?
Yeah, it's an SDLC thing, but I feel like it gets merged together quite a lot when you're working with like cloud native stuff.
Sometimes when I see like 100 new releases for whatever cloud provider I'm using, I'm like, do you know what? Maybe I'll just become the COBOL subject matter expert for the world and just charge bags of money to work on this ancient technology. So nothing changes. It'd be great.
No, so you're the guy deploying EKS in 2024. There you go.
In a segment shamelessly stolen from the 2.5 Admins show, we're going to do some free consulting. So first, thank you to the existing supporters on PayPal and Patreon. This is part of the Late Night Linux family, so for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. You can get details on how to support the show on hybridcloudshow.com/support. You can send your questions and your feedback to show@hybridcloudshow.com. The first question we'll start with is around what we think of the free tiers of AWS, Azure, Google as a way of getting started and learning about the cloud. So Joe says he finds it tempting, but he's heard horror stories of people ending up with massive bills, so he's always avoided them.
Speaking from experience of a £400 bill from a network interface I forgot to delete, you should set up billing alerts in whatever cloud provider you have for like $10 or something. Something where you just get triggered for the amount that would surprise you're going to spend. You will not regret doing that. So do that to start with.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd go with. Like, set up budgets, set up alerts, set them for something that you would be annoyed at yourself for spending to teach yourself good habits, but also that's not going to break the bank. So I do it similar to you, Shane. If it's more than 20 quid a month, I've got an alert that comes through. Likewise, like automating, deleting some of those resources is really good. So I have a Lambda that goes in once a month and deletes anything that I've not tagged with an auto delete equals no tag. So the Lambda costs pence to execute and it fits well within the free tier. So that also works pretty well. I know in Oracle land, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in Azure as well, that you don't even get charged unless you specifically go and upgrade to a paid for account. So you have to put in your credit card for identity validation. But unless you specifically say, you can take my money now, they won't do it. So that's also another good tip.
I would absolutely advise when you do these alerts and when you create these accounts to use a valid email and not one that is just a throwaway. So that way you actually receive the emails for the alerts.
Yeah, and that's also important for like security and operations alerts as well. A lot of these cloud providers, if like you upload an access key to GitHub by accident, will automatically alert you. So making sure there's a valid email address is pretty important there as well.
A lot of these clouds have got pretty detailed cost and billing stuff, right? So it's not the most thrilling thing to learn first when you're first going to start to play with the cloud, but it's an important one to get your head around so that you can make sure you understand what you're spending and where and which subscriptions or whatever are being monitored properly so that you've got the right alerts on the right subscriptions and that, as Gary says, lines up with what you expect to spend under each of those heads.
Yeah, get really familiar with like filtering cost by things like usage type and stuff like that. Get really familiar with what the most economical way to build the infrastructure you need is. And it's not always the thing with the smaller or lower number. Sometimes like a T3 instance is cheaper than a T2 instance, but it might not fit in the free tier. So being familiar with that is really important. Likewise for storage, GP3 is cheaper and quicker than GP2 storage in AWS land, but it also doesn't fit in the free tier. So it's just making sure you're really familiar with what those costs are and what they relate to. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that the smaller cloud providers like DigitalOcean, Linode, etc., generally have a bit more of an easy to understand pricing model. So if you're just getting started, maybe somewhere like that to get familiar with core concepts like Terraform might be good. I think at least Linode and DigitalOcean have Terraform providers, so maybe it's worth spinning up infrastructure there until you're familiar with the tooling, and then move on to one of the hyperscalers if you feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah, and I think there's a broader statement there that it depends exactly what you're trying to learn. Obviously, if you're trying to learn the control plane of a particular cloud, you're going to have to use that cloud. But if you're just trying to learn kind of cloud native concepts. There's a lot of other ways you can do that on-prem or in your own sort of home lab or something like that. I use LexC or LexD quite a lot in my home infrastructure, and there you can use a lot of the kind of cloud native sort of feeling things like Cloud Init and so forth to do your instance configuration if you want to. So you can play with a lot of those more cloudy type things even on your own on-prem infrastructure if you set things up properly.
That is absolutely very sage advice. One other thing that I would do is, no matter if it's on my private cloud or my public cloud, is when I'm trying new technology, I'm going to use Terraform, because that's what most people or most companies will use to manage their infrastructure once they decide to use it for real. And when I use Terraform, I'm able to quickly spin something up, run my tests, and then before I'm done for the day, I will tear it all down. And that allows me to make sure and have peace of mind that any cloud resource that I've set up gets taken away and I don't forget about it, or I forget that I detached it and didn't get handled somehow. So that's also some good advice there.
Yeah, Gary mentioned it before, but I've got a similar setup where I've got some filthy little Python script that just makes sure that it deletes the test group auto that I used for the automatic machine that spun up and SSH'd me in for whatever I was trying to test that day. But it's useful to have something that makes sure it gets rid of everything before you've spent too much money on it.
AWS Nuke is a nice tool as well if you want to do that. I use that at another company to wipe my dev accounts when I need to.
Yeah, Microsoft has a few good resources in there as well on their Learn site, where you've got some nice labs that you can spin up as part of the Learn process. So if you really are scared of spinning up environments, then that's an option that lets you play around inside Azure without being charged at all. It's not even your environment. So that's quite a nice option too if you're just looking to learn.
That's pretty handy.
Well, let's wrap this up. So thank you for joining us. If you want to check out the show notes, we'll put those on hybridcloudshow.com. And please do send in your questions or feedback to show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.